What happens when a woman defies the odds to take on a broken system? Sophia Carter thought she'd built the perfect airline, but behind the polished exterior lies corruption, betrayal, and a fight for justice that could cost her everything. Will she rise above the clouds or crash under the weight of truth? Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The cold wind outside cut through the glass walls of JFK International Airport as bustling travelers shuffled from one terminal to the next. Inside, the terminal was alive with the sights and sounds of the holiday season. Strings of twinkling lights adorned every corner, reflecting off glossy tiled floors. Holiday decorations sat atop counters, and the faint scent of cinnamon and roasted chestnuts wafted from a nearby cafe. In one corner, a trio of musicians, dressed in festive sweaters, played soft jazz. The melodic hum of a saxophone blended with the rhythmic tapping of a bass, creating a momentary escape for those rushing to catch their flights. The large screens above displayed rows of flight information, some marked on time, others flashing delayed. Sophia Carter adjusted her coat as she stepped up to the check-in counter for the first-class line. The polished black leather of her boots clicked faintly against the floor. Her style was understated yet elegant. A wool trench coat, a silk scarf draped around her neck, and a sleek black carry-on at her side. At first glance, she might seem like just another busy traveler, but there was a quiet strength in her posture, a sense of purpose that set her apart. She handed her ticket to the agent, her smile warm but reserved. "Good afternoon. First class to Los Angeles," she said calmly, her voice steady yet polite. The agent, a young man with a nervous smile, scanned her ticket. "Of course, Ms. Carter, you're all set. Your flight board's at gate 14 in about an hour. Enjoy your trip." As Sophia stepped away, her sharp ears caught snippets of a hushed conversation between two employees standing near the counter. "Did you see that? She's flying first class?" one of them muttered, their voice tinged with skepticism. "Yeah, you'd think people like her would stick to coach," the other replied with a slight chuckle. Sophia's steps faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. She didn't turn to look at them, but her grip on the handle of her carry-on tightened. The words weren't new to her. They echoed countless other moments she had faced throughout her life. Yet each time they stung just as sharply. Taking a deep breath, she reminded herself of her purpose. This trip wasn't about proving her worth to anyone. It was about reconnecting with her family. She had worked tirelessly over the past year as the CEO of Skyline Airways, ensuring the company thrived while upholding values of equality and fairness. This short break was long overdue. Making her way through the terminal, Sophia let the festive atmosphere soothe her. The sound of children laughing near a toy display and the warm glow of holiday lights brought a fleeting smile to her face. She stopped briefly at a cafe to grab a hot cup of tea, savoring the warmth against her chilled hands. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, calling passengers for her flight. With her carry-on in tow, Sophia headed toward the gate. As she approached the boarding area for first-class passengers, she noticed a female flight attendant standing near the entrance to the plane. The woman's name tag read Jessica Whitman. Her polished uniform and tightly tied bun gave her an air of authority. Jessica's eyes briefly met Sophia's, and there was a flicker of something unspoken, a mixture of surprise and disapproval that Sophia had learned to recognize all too well. Sophia's smile remained cordial as she handed over her boarding pass. Jessica scanned it and returned it with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Welcome aboard," Jessica said, her tone polite but devoid of warmth. Sophia nodded and stepped into the plane, the faint unease lingering in her chest. Something about that brief interaction unsettled her, but she chose to brush it off. This was supposed to be a time of rest and connection, not confrontation. She found her seat in the first-class cabin, a spacious and comfortable corner with a window view. Settling in, Sophia placed her bag neatly in the overhead compartment and sat down, smoothing her coat over her lap. The hum of the engines outside served as a gentle reminder that soon she'd be leaving behind the cold streets of New York for the sunny skies of Los Angeles. As passengers continued to board, Sophia leaned back in her seat, letting her eyes close for a moment. But the memory of the conversation at the check-in counter lingered, along with Jessica's subtle but unmistakable judgment. Sophia settled into her first-class seat, letting the soft leather cushion her back. The window beside her framed the growing darkness outside, faintly lit by the runway's blinking lights. She placed her carry-on neatly beneath her feet, adjusted the scarf around her neck, and opened a magazine from the pocket in front of her. The luxury of the cabin, with its wide seats and soft ambient lighting, was a rare respite from her hectic schedule. Her brief moment of peace was interrupted when Jessica Whitman, the flight attendant she had encountered at the boarding gate, approached her seat. Jessica carried a tablet in one hand and wore a polished smile that seemed more mechanical than genuine. "Excuse me," Jessica said, her tone clipped but professional. "I believe there may be an issue with your seat assignment." Sophia looked up, mildly surprised. "No, I don't think so. I've got my ticket right here." She reached into her coat pocket, retrieving the neatly folded boarding pass. Jessica hesitated as she glanced at the ticket. Her smile faltered briefly before she continued. "I see. But it's possible there's been a mistake in the system. We'll need to verify your seat. In the meantime, I'll have to ask you to move to the main cabin until this is sorted out." Sophia's expression remained calm, but there was a distinct shift in her demeanor. "This is my assigned seat," she said firmly, her voice steady. "I purchased a first-class ticket, and I have every right to be here." Jessica's brows knitted together, and her smile tightened. "Of course, but I'll still need to confirm. Procedures, you understand." Sophia leaned back slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I understand procedures, but I also understand when I'm being singled out. I'm not moving." The tension between them began to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Murmurs rippled through the cabin as Jessica's professional facade began to crack. Her voice grew sharper, more forceful. "Ma'am," she said louder now, "I'm trying to handle this politely, but if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have no choice but to involve security." Sophia's chest tightened, but she refused to let her composure slip. "You're welcome to verify my ticket right here. There's no need for this to escalate." Before Jessica could respond, a man seated across the aisle spoke up. He was older, with graying hair and a kindly demeanor. His voice carried an air of authority as he addressed Jessica. "She's already shown you her ticket. Why don't you just leave her be?" he said, his tone firm but calm. Jessica shot the man a disapproving glance but ignored his comment. Turning back to Sophia, she said, "I'm going to have to insist, ma'am." Sophia exhaled slowly, knowing she had little choice if she wanted to avoid causing a scene. With deliberate movements, she stood, gathered her things, and stepped aside. The humiliation burned under her skin as she felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, some curious, others judgmental. Jessica gestured toward the direction of the main cabin, and as Sophia moved past her, she noticed the flight attendant exchange a glance with one of her colleagues. There was a faint smirk on Jessica's face, barely noticeable but impossible to miss. "She'll be more comfortable there," Jessica murmured, just loud enough for Sophia to hear. Sophia's grip on her carry-on tightened, but she said nothing. Her silence was not out of submission, but out of restraint. She knew this moment, however painful, would not define her response. As she walked down the aisle to the economy section, she passed Henry Walsh, the man who had tried to defend her. He caught her eye and gave her a small, apologetic nod. "I'm sorry about this," he said softly, his voice filled with genuine regret. Sophia offered him a faint smile, appreciating his effort, even if it had been futile. "Thank you," she replied simply before continuing to her reassigned seat. Settling into the cramped space of the main cabin, Sophia looked out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the darkened glass. Her thoughts raced, not just with the sting of humiliation, but with the realization that this wasn't just about her. Jessica's actions weren't merely a mistake or a misunderstanding. They were a reflection of a deeper issue, one Sophia had seen time and time again. But this time, she resolved, she wouldn't let it go unanswered. The narrow confines of the economy cabin seemed to shrink around Sophia as she settled into her seat. The worn fabric of the cushion lacked the comfort she'd briefly experienced in first class, and the faint hum of conversation from passengers around her only added to her sense of isolation. She placed her carry-on under the seat in front of her, crossing her hands on her lap in an effort to maintain her composure. The cabin was a stark contrast to the polished elegance she had left behind. Children squirmed in their seats. Tired parents whispered soothing words, and the occasional loud laugh or rustle of snack wrappers punctuated the ambient noise. Sophia stared out the window, her reflection faintly visible against the evening sky. Her thoughts churned relentlessly, replaying the interaction with Jessica. The humiliation lingered like an unwelcome weight on her chest. She clenched her jaw as she tried to push the memory aside, but it persisted, each detail sharper than the last. Her mind drifted back to years before, to a time when she was fresh out of college, eager and determined to carve her place in a world that seemed intent on underestimating her. Back then, it had been her age, her gender, and most prominently, her skin color, that seemed to dictate how others perceived her. She remembered her first job interview in the aviation industry. The hiring manager had looked her up and down before saying, "You're certainly ambitious, but this field is competitive. Perhaps you should aim for something more attainable." Sophia had smiled politely, but the words stung. Those moments had fueled her drive, pushing her to work harder, longer, and smarter than her peers. But no matter how many accolades she earned or how high she climbed, the shadows of those judgments always lingered. She sighed deeply, her breath fogging the window for a brief moment. Despite her position as CEO, moments like this made her question the true extent of her power. Could she ever truly dismantle the biases that seemed so deeply entrenched? Or was her success just a veneer, hiding a system that remained unyielding beneath the surface? "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice interrupted her thoughts. Sophia turned to see the man from earlier, the one who had spoken up for her in first class. His graying hair and warm, lined face gave him an air of wisdom and kindness. He gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Mind if I sit here for a bit?" he asked. "Not at all," Sophia replied, offering a small smile. As he lowered himself into the seat, he extended his hand. "Henry Walsh, I just wanted to say, what happened back there was completely unacceptable." "Thank you," Sophia said, shaking his hand. "I appreciate you speaking up. It meant a lot." Henry shrugged. "Didn't seem to do much good. That flight attendant was determined to have her way." Sophia's smile tightened. "It's not the first time I've dealt with something like this. Unfortunately, I doubt it'll be the last." Henry studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "You handled yourself with a lot of grace, more than most people would have." Sophia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It never gets easier," she admitted softly. "You'd think it would, but it doesn't." Henry nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. I used to be a lawyer, spent most of my career fighting discrimination cases. Thought I could change the system, but, well, let's just say the system has a way of wearing you down." Sophia glanced at him, curious. "What made you stop?" Henry sighed, his gaze distant. "I got tired of fighting battles I couldn't win. It felt like for every step forward, we'd get pushed 2 steps back. Eventually, I decided to step away and let someone else take up the fight." There was a pause before he added, "But seeing what happened to you today, it reminds me why I started in the first place. Maybe it's time I did something again." Sophia smiled faintly. "Maybe." Henry leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering as if sharing a secret. "Look, I know it feels overwhelming, trying to fix something so broken. But change doesn't happen all at once. It's the small actions, the quiet ones, that make a difference. Don't forget that." Sophia nodded, his words sinking in. "I'll try to remember that," she said quietly. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps. A young flight attendant walked briskly past them, speaking in hushed tones to her colleague. "Jessica's at it again," the attendant said, her tone exasperated. "She's always so obsessed with keeping first class exclusive." She made air quotes as she said the word, rolling her eyes. "It's like she thinks it's her personal kingdom." Sophia's ears perked up at the comment. She exchanged a glance with Henry, who raised an eyebrow in silent acknowledgement. "Interesting," Henry murmured. Sophia leaned back in her seat, her expression unreadable. But inside, her resolve was hardening. Jessica's actions weren't just about a bad attitude. They reflected a deeper issue, one that Sophia knew she couldn't ignore. As the flight continued, Sophia began to formulate a plan. This wasn't just about one flight attendant or one bad interaction. This was about the culture of the company she had worked so hard to lead. The plane landed with a gentle thud, its wheels skimming across the runway of Los Angeles International Airport. Passengers around Sophia stirred, gathering their belongings, chatting about their plans, or glancing impatiently at their phones. Sophia remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She had no intention of rushing. She watched as Jessica Whitman moved through the first-class cabin, her practiced smile firmly in place as she bid farewell to the disembarking passengers. Jessica's tone shifted subtly, depending on who she spoke to. A warm and almost deferential tone for the well-dressed businessman in a tailored suit, a brisk but polite nod for a casually dressed woman with a toddler. Sophia noticed these details with the sharp eye of someone accustomed to reading between the lines. It wasn't the words Jessica chose, but the subtle changes in her body language. How she stood slightly straighter for certain passengers, how her smile grew tighter for others. It was a pattern Sophia had seen before, and it only solidified her resolve. She waited until the last passenger in her section had gathered their belongings and left before she finally stood, taking her carry-on from the overhead bin. Jessica's eyes flicked to her briefly, but there was no acknowledgement, no smile, just a curt nod as Sophia stepped into the aisle. Walking through the jet bridge and into the terminal, Sophia kept her pace steady, her eyes scanning the flow of people around her. Jessica and the other flight attendants were a few steps ahead, their uniforms pristine, their chatter low and seemingly professional. But Sophia caught snippets of their conversation as she followed. "Another long day," one of them murmured. Jessica chuckled softly. At least most of the passengers were decent this time. Makes the job easier when the cabin stays exclusive. Sophia's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The word hung in her mind. Exclusive. It was the kind of term used to veil biases behind professionalism, the kind that people like Jessica wielded without a second thought. As the flight crew disappeared into a restricted staff area, Sophia made her way toward the baggage claim, her mind racing. She had no concrete plan yet, but her instincts told her this wasn't just about one individual. It rarely ever was. When she reached the terminal's main hall, she paused, letting the energy of the bustling airport surround her. Travelers hurried past, some greeting loved ones with hugs and laughter, others moving with the focused efficiency of seasoned flyers. "Miss Carter," a familiar voice called out. Turning, Sophia saw Henry Walsh approaching, a small leather briefcase in hand. His easy smile and relaxed demeanor were a welcome contrast to the tension of the flight. "Henry," she greeted, her expression softening. "You didn't have to wait." "I wanted to," he replied. "After what happened, I figured the least I could do was make sure you got off the flight in one piece." Sophia laughed lightly, though there was little humor in it. "I appreciate that." Henry reached into his pocket and handed her a crisp white business card. "If you ever need someone to back you up, or even just listen, give me a call. Sometimes the right kind of support makes all the difference." Sophia took the card, her fingers brushing against its embossed text. "Thank you, Henry. That means a lot." Henry gave her a knowing look. "You've got the strength to handle this, but don't forget, you're not alone. And sometimes, doing the right thing is the hardest thing of all." Sophia nodded, her grip on the card tightening slightly. "I'll keep that in mind." With a final smile, Henry walked away, disappearing into the sea of travelers. Sophia watched him go before slipping the card into her coat pocket. As she stepped outside into the cool Los Angeles evening, a notification buzzed on her phone. It was a message from her executive assistant, reminding her of an upcoming internal event for Skyline Airways. Sophia read the details carefully. The event was a high-level gathering of senior staff, designed to discuss the company's performance and future initiatives. She realized this could be the perfect opportunity to look deeper into the culture of the company, an environment she had believed in, but now suspected harbored deeper flaws. By the time she arrived at her hotel, her thoughts had already shifted into action. Dropping her bag by the door, Sophia pulled out her laptop and opened the company's internal database. She typed Jessica Whitman's name into the search bar, her fingers moving with purpose. The results came quickly: employee records, performance reviews, and incident reports. To Sophia's dismay, Jessica's file was far from spotless. There were multiple complaints from passengers citing unprofessional behavior, each describing interactions eerily similar to what Sophia had experienced. Yet every single complaint had been marked resolved with minimal follow-up. The pattern was unmistakable. Jessica's actions weren't just tolerated, they were being actively overlooked. Sophia leaned back in her chair, the weight of realization settling over her. This wasn't just about one person. It was about a system that allowed behavior like Jessica's to persist unchecked. If the system is broken, Sophia murmured to herself, then it's my responsibility to fix it. Her reflection stared back at her from the laptop screen. She felt a spark of clarity. She wasn't just confronting Jessica or addressing a personal grievance. She was stepping into a fight for the integrity of the company she had built her career around. Sophia closed the laptop with a decisive click, her resolve hardening. The days ahead would demand courage, but she was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The Skyline Airways corporate event was held in the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of the city, its glittering lights stretching out beneath the night sky. Employees and executives mingled in the warmly lit space, their voices blending with the soft hum of a string quartet in the corner. The atmosphere was polished, professional, and full of carefully managed smiles. Sophia entered the room with quiet confidence. Her tailored navy suit was understated but elegant, her presence commanding without being overt. She moved through the crowd with ease, greeting colleagues with a polite smile or a firm handshake. To any observer, she was just another executive. Few people in the room recognized her as the CEO. At the far end of the room, Jessica Whitman stood in a small circle of colleagues, laughing lightly at something one of them had said. Her demeanor was self-assured, almost smug. Sophia noticed how Jessica's posture shifted subtly as different people approached, deferential toward those in higher positions, dismissive of those she deemed unimportant. Sophia made no effort to interact with Jessica directly, instead observing from a distance. She noticed how Jessica spoke to a junior flight attendant, her tone sharp and condescending as she corrected a minor detail about their service protocols. The young woman's face flushed with embarrassment, but Jessica didn't seem to care. Sophia's attention was interrupted when a staff member approached to announce the start of the evening's discussion panel. The topic, customer experience, and the future of Skyline Airways. Sophia took her seat at the head of the room, her expression calm as she addressed the audience. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. "Skyline has always prided itself on delivering exceptional service. But as we look toward the future, it's important to ask ourselves, are we truly meeting the expectations of every customer who walks through our doors?" She paused, letting the question settle over the room. "This evening, I want to hear from you, the people who interact with our passengers every day. What are we doing right? And more importantly, where are we falling short?" For a moment, the room was silent. Then slowly, hands began to rise. A young flight attendant stood first. Her voice was tentative but firm as she spoke. "I think sometimes we judge people too quickly, based on how they look, how they're dressed. It's not fair, and it doesn't reflect well on us as a company." Sophia nodded, encouraging her to continue. "I've seen passengers in first class get treated differently because they don't look the part," the attendant added, glancing nervously at Jessica. "And honestly, it's uncomfortable to witness. It's not what I thought this company stood for." The tension in the room was palpable. Jessica's expression tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Thank you for sharing," Sophia said warmly, her gaze sweeping the room. "Does anyone else have thoughts on this?" More hands went up. Several employees echoed similar concerns, speaking cautiously but candidly about the subtle biases they'd observed in the company's culture. Jessica finally spoke up, her tone clipped. "I think it's important to remember that maintaining a certain standard in first class is part of our responsibility. It's about creating the right atmosphere for our premium customers." Sophia didn't miss the undertone in Jessica's words. "And how do you define that standard, Jessica?" she asked evenly. Jessica hesitated, clearly unprepared for the question. "Well, it's about professionalism, ensuring that the space reflects the values of the company. And those values are," Sophia pressed gently, her voice calm but pointed. Jessica faltered, her usual confidence visibly shaken. Excellence. Consistency, she said finally, avoiding Sophia's gaze. Sophia let the silence stretch for a moment before turning back to the room. Our values should include fairness, respect, and inclusivity, she said firmly. Without those, excellence and consistency mean very little. The discussion continued, and as more employees spoke, it became clear to Sophia that Jessica's behavior was not an isolated issue. Several attendants mentioned instances where complaints about bias or unprofessional conduct had been ignored or brushed aside by management. By the end of the session, Sophia had a clearer picture of the systemic problems plaguing Skyline Airways. It wasn't just about Jessica. It was about a culture that allowed people like her to thrive unchecked. Later that evening, Sophia requested a private meeting with a few senior managers. She asked for detailed reports on all customer service complaints logged in the past 2 years, particularly those involving bias or unprofessional behavior. The next morning, the reports landed in her inbox. As she sifted through them, a troubling pattern emerged. Jessica's name appeared frequently, often attached to complaints from passengers who described feeling mistreated or judged. But every case had been marked resolved, with no indication of any meaningful action taken. One detail stood out. Jessica had a close connection to a senior manager in the customer service department, someone who had repeatedly downplayed or dismissed the complaints against her. Sophia closed the file, her expression unreadable. She reached for her phone and dialed her assistant. "Schedule a meeting with Jessica Whitman," she said, "and keep it off the books." Her voice was calm, but there was a steely determination in her tone. It was time to confront Jessica directly and to begin addressing the deeper issues within Skyline Airways. Jessica Whitman entered the conference room with her usual air of confidence, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. The room was smaller than she had expected, devoid of the usual corporate buzz that accompanied meetings with upper management. She had assumed this would be a routine discussion about policies or protocols, another opportunity to flaunt her adherence to standards. What she didn't expect was to find Sophia Carter seated at the head of the table. Jessica paused, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she recovered. She hadn't recognized Sophia during the flight, and now, seeing her in a position of undeniable authority, the realization hit her like a wave. "Please have a seat," Sophia said calmly, gesturing to the chair opposite her. Jessica hesitated but complied, lowering herself into the seat. "I didn't realize you'd be attending this meeting," she said, her voice laced with caution. Sophia leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "I'm not just attending, Jessica. I called this meeting." There was a beat of silence before Sophia continued, her tone measured but firm. "I've reviewed the complaints filed against you over the past few years, and I've also seen your behavior firsthand on the flight to Los Angeles." Jessica straightened, her hands clasped neatly on the table. "With all due respect, Ms. Carter, I believe I was simply doing my job. My role is to ensure that first class maintains its reputation as a premium experience." Sophia's gaze didn't waver. "And you believe that includes questioning whether paying passengers deserve their seats?" Jessica's composure cracked slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "It wasn't personal. I was following protocol. We're trained to maintain a certain standard." "Protocol?" Sophia repeated, her voice carrying a quiet weight. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked more like personal judgment." Jessica's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Sophia continued, her tone sharper now. "You've had multiple complaints filed against you, Jessica. Passengers who felt disrespected, overlooked, or outright mistreated, and yet every single one of those complaints was dismissed. Why do you think that is?" Jessica hesitated, her confidence visibly wavering. "I don't control how complaints are handled," she said defensively. "That's up to management." "True," Sophia agreed, "but the behavior that led to those complaints, that's entirely within your control." Jessica's face reddened slightly. "Look," she said, her voice rising, "this company has always operated this way. We're expected to uphold a certain image. I didn't create the system. I'm just working within it. If anything, I've been doing what's expected of me." Sophia studied her carefully. "You're saying the system is flawed?" Jessica hesitated again, clearly unsure how to answer. I'm saying that the expectations have always been clear. First class is for a certain type of passenger. It's not my fault if some people don't fit the profile. Sophia's expression hardened, though her voice remained steady. That's an interesting perspective, because to me, it sounds like you're justifying discrimination. Jessica's eyes widened slightly, her confidence now fully shaken. I wouldn't call it that, she said quickly. I'm just trying to maintain the integrity of the service. Sophia leaned back in her chair, her gaze unrelenting. And who gets to decide what that integrity looks like? You. For a moment, the room was silent. Jessica shifted uncomfortably under Sophia's piercing stare. Finally, Sophia spoke again, her voice cold and precise. If the system is broken, that's on me to fix. But your actions, your choices, are yours alone, and they have consequences. Jessica opened her mouth to protest but stopped herself. Her usual defenses seemed insufficient under Sophia's scrutiny. I'm placing you on immediate suspension, Sophia said, her tone leaving no room for argument. During this time, there will be a full investigation into your behavior and the management practices that allowed it to continue unchecked. If we find evidence that you've knowingly engaged in or perpetuated discriminatory practices, there will be further consequences. Jessica stared at her, disbelief and indignation warring on her face. You can't. I can, Sophia interrupted, her voice calm but firm. And I will. The finality of Sophia's words silenced any further protests. Jessica rose from her seat, her face a mask of barely concealed fury. You'll regret this, she said quietly, before turning and walking out of the room. Sophia watched her go, the weight of the encounter settling over her. She didn't regret her decision, but she knew it was only the beginning. Jessica was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that ran deep within Skyline Airways. As she sat alone in the now empty room, Sophia allowed herself a moment to reflect. The challenges ahead were daunting, but they were necessary. This wasn't just about one flight or one employee. It was about the culture of the entire company. Sophia exhaled slowly, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let this go unanswered. If the system is flawed, she murmured to herself, then I'll fix it, from the ground up. Sophia sat in her office, her eyes fixed on the report spread across her desk. The document was exhaustive, detailing years of systemic issues within Skyline Airways. At its core was a disturbing revelation. Jessica was not acting alone. There was a network of middle management quietly perpetuating the same discriminatory practices under the guise of maintaining standards. One line in particular caught Sophia's attention. Jessica had been awarded Employee of the Year twice, with glowing reviews from select high-profile passengers. The names on those reviews painted a clear picture: affluent, white business travelers who seemed to align perfectly with the so-called ideal image of first-class passengers. Sophia leaned back in her chair, a deep sigh escaping her lips. It was worse than she had imagined. This wasn't just about Jessica's personal bias. It was a systemic problem, woven into the company's very culture. She closed the report and glanced at her calendar. The meeting with the executive team was scheduled for later that day. It would not be a comfortable conversation, but it was one that could no longer be avoided. That afternoon, the conference room was filled with Skyline senior leaders. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. As Sophia took her seat at the head of the table, the room quieted. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice steady. I've spent the past week reviewing complaints and performance data from the past several years. What I've found is deeply troubling. She placed a copy of the report on the table, letting the weight of her words sink in. This company prides itself on excellence, but that excellence has been compromised by a culture of exclusion. Complaints of discrimination and unprofessional conduct have been ignored, dismissed, or outright buried. Murmurs rippled through the room. One executive, Richard Kane, sat forward in his chair, his expression hard. Sophia, with all due respect, we can't address every single complaint. It's simply not realistic. Sophia met his gaze. This isn't about isolated incidents, Richard. This is about a pattern, one that's been allowed to persist for far too long. Richard's tone grew defensive. We have to maintain a certain image for our premium services, Not every passenger fits that image. It's not discrimination, it's strategy. Sophia's eyes narrowed. Strategy doesn't involve demeaning passengers or disregarding valid concerns. If our image comes at the expense of fairness and respect, then it's the wrong image. Richard leaned back, his arms crossed. You can't overhaul the entire system just to cater to a few complaints. The majority of our passengers are satisfied. Isn't that what matters? Sophia's voice remained calm, but there was steel in her tone. No, Richard. What matters is creating a company where every passenger feels valued. That's not catering. That's doing what's right. The tension in the room was palpable. Some executives nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. After the meeting, Sophia returned to her office, her mind racing. She knew Richard's resistance wasn't just about company policy. His defensive stance, his dismissal of complaints, it all pointed to a deeper involvement. Later that evening, as Sophia was reviewing additional documents, her phone buzzed. It was an email from an unknown sender. If you keep digging, you'll regret it. Walk away while you still can. Sophia stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Sophia sat at her desk, the glow from her laptop illuminating her face as the morning sun filtered through the office blinds. The stakes had never felt higher, but retreat was not an option. She had spent her career building Skyline Airways into a respected company, and now, faced with evidence of systemic failures, she resolved to fix it, not superficially, but at its core. Her first move was assembling a team she could trust. She picked up her phone and dialed Henry Walsh. Henry, I'm pulling together a task force to investigate what's been happening inside the company, she said without preamble. I need someone with your experience to help navigate this. There was a pause before Henry replied. You're taking a risk, Sophia, but if you're ready to fight this battle, I'll stand with you. With Henry on board, Sophia reached out to a handful of lower-level managers, individuals she knew had witnessed issues firsthand, but had remained silent out of fear. One by one, she brought them into the fold, emphasizing the importance of their voices. This isn't just about fixing what's wrong, she told them during their first meeting. It's about rebuilding something better. But I can't do it without you. Her words struck a chord, and though there was hesitation in their faces, there was also determination. As her team got to work, Sophia made her next bold move. A company-wide memo outlining a new zero-tolerance policy on discrimination and abuse of power. The policy was clear and uncompromising. All employees, regardless of position, will be held accountable for their actions. Investigations into past complaints will be reopened, and any credible findings will result in disciplinary action. The memo sent ripples through the company. For some, it was a sign of long overdue reform, a chance to correct years of unchecked behavior. For others, particularly those in upper management, it was a direct threat. Richard Kane, in particular, saw it as a declaration of war. From his corner office, he began maneuvering to protect his allies and undermine Sophia's efforts. He called private meetings with senior staff, urging them to resist the changes. She's making a mess, he said during one such meeting. This isn't about fairness. It's about her ego. If we don't push back, she'll destroy everything we've built. But Sophia remained undeterred. Her task force worked quietly but diligently, gathering testimonies from employees across the company. Many were reluctant to speak, their voices trembling as they recounted stories of mistreatment, but Sophia's assurance of confidentiality and her unwavering commitment slowly began to build trust. One afternoon, Lisa, a young manager who had joined Sophia's team, brought her a file she had uncovered during the investigation. It contained records of client transactions that didn't align with standard procedures, payments for special services tied directly to Richard's department. These aren't just service upgrades, Lisa explained. They're bribes. Certain clients were paying for preferential treatment, and Richard was making sure they got it. Sophia's expression darkened. This wasn't just about discriminatory behavior. It was about corruption. As the days passed, the pushback grew stronger. One evening, as Sophia reviewed documents in her office, Lisa burst in, her face pale. Someone called me, Lisa said, her voice shaking. They didn't give their name, but they told me to back off, or else. Sophia's hands tightened into fists. Fear was the weapon of those who knew they were losing control. She placed a reassuring hand on Lisa's shoulder. You're not alone in this. We're going to see it through no matter what. That night, Sophia gathered her team for a private meeting. The tension in the room was palpable, but her voice was steady as she addressed them. We're not just fighting for this company, she said. We're fighting for the people who have been ignored and dismissed for far too long. If we succeed, we won't just change Skyline Airways. We'll set a standard for the entire industry. Her words reignited the determination in her team. They nodded, their resolve hardening. As the meeting ended, Sophia returned to her office only to find a new email waiting in her inbox. The subject line was blank, and the sender's address was untraceable. The message read, "If you continue, everything you've built will fall apart." Sophia leaned back in her chair, her jaw tightening. The threat was clear, but so was her purpose. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. Not now, not ever. Sophia stared out the window of her office as twilight settled over the city. The skyline glowed with warm hues of orange and gold, but her mind was far from serene. The weight of the past few weeks bore down on her shoulders, and her once steely confidence now felt precarious. The knock at her door broke her thoughts. It was Henry Walsh, his face lined with concern as he entered. "We need to talk," he said, placing a file on her desk. Sophia gestured for him to sit. "What is it?" "It's Laura," he began, his tone grave. "She's been let go. No explanation, just a notice from HR this morning." Sophia's heart sank. Laura had been one of the most dedicated members of her task force, unearthing critical details about the company's systemic issues. "Richard's doing," Henry added, his voice tight with frustration. "He's starting to push back harder. This is his way of sending a message." Sophia clenched her fist beneath the desk. She had expected resistance, but this deliberate move against one of her team members felt like a direct attack. "I'll speak to HR," she said firmly. "Laura's dismissal won't stand. And if Richard thinks this is going to intimidate me, he's sorely mistaken." Despite her words, doubt crept into Sophia's mind. She knew the risks of continuing down this path. Richard and his allies wielded significant power within the company, and exposing them could provoke a backlash that threatened not just her position, but the company's stability as a whole. Later that evening, as she reviewed documents in her dimly lit office, her phone buzzed. The caller ID was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer. "Sophia Carter," she said, keeping her tone professional. "It's Jessica," the voice on the other end replied. Sophia's grip on the phone tightened. "Jessica, to what do I owe the pleasure?" There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "I need to talk to you, in person." Sophia hesitated, unsure of Jessica's motives. "Why now?" "Because I know you're investigating me, and you're not going to like what you find," Jessica admitted, her voice tinged with both anger and fear. Sophia agreed to meet her in a neutral location, a quiet cafe away from prying eyes. When Jessica arrived, she looked markedly different from the self-assured flight attendant Sophia had encountered. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "What do you want, Jessica?" Sophia asked, her tone sharp but measured. Jessica sat down, fidgeting with her hands. "You need to understand, I wasn't acting alone. Everything I did was because of Richard." Sophia's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Jessica swallowed hard. "He's the one who set the rules. He told me to keep first class exclusive. No exceptions. He said it was about protecting the company's image, but it always felt like more than that. Like he wanted to make sure certain people didn't feel welcome." Sophia leaned forward, her voice low. "Why didn't you come forward before now?" "Because I didn't think it mattered," Jessica admitted bitterly. "Richard's untouchable. He has connections everywhere. But now that you're digging into this, I know he's going to throw me under the bus to save himself." Sophia studied Jessica carefully, weighing her words. There was desperation in her voice, but also a hint of guilt. "If you have proof," Sophia said slowly, "now is the time to share it." Jessica hesitated before reaching into her bag and pulling out a flash drive. "This has everything: emails, memos, even a list of clients Richard gave special treatment to. He's been running a whole operation behind the scenes." Sophia took the drive, her resolve hardening. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just about you or Richard. It's about the culture of this entire company. And I won't let it continue. Jessica nodded, her expression a mix of relief and apprehension. Just be careful. Richard doesn't lose quietly. Back in her office, Sophia plugged the drive into her laptop. The files Jessica provided were damning. They detailed a secret program overseen by Richard, offering preferential treatment to select VIP clients, nearly all of whom fit a very specific demographic. Worse, there were records showing that Richard had used company resources to fund these perks while marginalizing other customers. Sophia felt a mix of anger and determination as she scrolled through the documents. This wasn't just about unethical practices. It was about a deliberate effort to uphold a discriminatory status quo. The next morning, Sophia called an emergency meeting with her core team. She laid the evidence out on the table, her voice steady but resolute. "This is bigger than Richard," she began. "It's about a system that's been allowed to thrive unchecked for years. If we're going to fix this, we need to expose it entirely." Henry leaned forward, his expression serious. "You know what this means, Sophia. If you go public with this, Richard and his allies won't just fight back. They'll try to destroy you." Sophia nodded, the weight of his words settling heavily on her shoulders. "I know, but if I stay silent, I'm complicit, and I can't live with that." As the meeting adjourned, Sophia lingered in the room, staring at the files spread across the table. The choice ahead of her was clear, but it was far from easy. She took a deep breath, her mind made up. "If this company is going to fall apart," she murmured to herself, "it won't be because of me. It'll be because I tried to save it." The conference room was heavy with tension as Skyline Airways senior leadership gathered for a meeting that felt anything but routine. Richard Kane sat at one end of the long table, his posture rigid and his expression carefully neutral. Across from him sat Sophia Carter, her calm demeanor belying the storm brewing within. The meeting had barely begun when Richard made his move. "Before we dive into today's agenda," Richard began, his tone smooth but loaded, "I think it's important we address the distractions that have been circulating lately." Sophia raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing him to continue. "As many of you know," Richard said, his gaze sweeping the room, "Sophia has taken it upon herself to launch an internal investigation into matters she deems problematic. While I commend her dedication, I fear her approach lacks perspective." He leaned back in his chair, his voice growing more pointed. "Sophia doesn't seem to understand how a business of this size operates. Decisions aren't always black and white. Sometimes they're about survival, ensuring the company remains profitable and competitive. But instead of focusing on our financial goals, she's allowing her personal feelings to dictate policy." A murmur spread through the room. Some executives nodded subtly, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Sophia remained silent, her gaze fixed on Richard. "And let's not forget," Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "leadership requires a certain pedigree. It's not just about ambition. It's about understanding the nuances of the corporate world, something that can't always be learned." The insinuation was clear. Richard was calling her out not just as a CEO, but as a woman who had risen from a background he deemed unfit for the role. Sophia finally spoke, her voice steady but firm. "Are you finished, Richard?" Richard gestured for her to proceed, a faint smirk on his lips. Sophia stood, placing a folder on the table in front of her. "I'm glad you brought up leadership and accountability, because that's exactly what we're here to discuss today." She opened the folder and pulled out a stack of papers. "Over the past few weeks, I've been reviewing internal communications, complaints, and financial records. What I've found is deeply troubling." She turned to the room, her gaze unwavering. "Richard has been orchestrating a program that prioritizes certain clients at the expense of others. This program isn't about maintaining standards. It's about exclusion. And it's about profit." The room fell silent as Sophia laid out the evidence. A series of emails between Richard and his allies in management. The emails detailed explicit instructions to Jessica and other staff members, encouraging them to ensure that first-class passengers fit a specific demographic. "This," Sophia said, holding up one particularly damning email, "is a directive from Richard himself, instructing staff to deny upgrades to passengers who don't meet his criteria for what he calls an appropriate image. Richard's face darkened, but Sophia wasn't finished. And then there's this, she continued, pulling out another document. A record of financial transactions tied to Richard's department. These payments show that certain clients were offered preferential treatment, not based on loyalty or merit, but because they paid for it. These deals were made without transparency, diverting resources from the rest of the company. The room erupted into chaos. Voices overlapped as executives reacted to the revelations. Some demanded explanations from Richard, while others questioned how this had been allowed to continue unchecked. Richard stood, his face red with anger. "This is a gross misrepresentation," he shouted. "Those emails are taken out of context, and those transactions were legitimate business decisions. You're twisting the facts to suit your narrative, Sophia." Sophia didn't flinch. "The facts speak for themselves, Richard. And this isn't just my narrative. It's the truth. The culture you've cultivated has hurt our employees, our customers, and our company's reputation." The divide in the room became clear. Some executives sided with Richard, arguing that his actions were necessary for maintaining the company's financial success. Others, particularly those who had witnessed the fallout of his decisions firsthand, voiced their support for Sophia. "This isn't about profit," one junior manager said, standing up. "It's about values. If we keep operating this way, we're going to lose the trust of our customers and our employees." Sophia nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Profit without integrity isn't sustainable. If we want to thrive in the long term, we need to rebuild trust from the ground up." By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Richard's position was no longer as secure as he had believed. But he wasn't ready to back down. That evening, Richard held a private meeting with several of Skyline's largest investors. He painted Sophia as reckless and inexperienced, claiming that her reforms would alienate key clients and jeopardize the company's bottom line. The next morning, a statement from Richard was released to the press. In it, he accused Sophia of undermining the company's success and pushing a personal agenda that risked the financial stability of Skyline Airways. Sophia read the statement in her office, her jaw tightening as she absorbed his latest move. She knew this battle was far from over. Richard wasn't just fighting to save himself. He was fighting to destroy her. But as she closed the article, Sophia's resolve only grew stronger. "If this is the fight he wants," she murmured, "then it's the fight he'll get." The boardroom was filled to capacity, its walls lined with senior executives and investors who sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed tension. At the head of the table stood Sophia Carter, her posture commanding but calm. She held a folder of documents tightly in one hand, while the other rested on the edge of the polished oak table. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Sophia began, her voice steady and deliberate. "Today's meeting is not just about the future of Skyline Airways. It's about defining who we are and what we stand for." She let her words settle before continuing. "Over the past several weeks, my team and I have uncovered troubling evidence of systemic discrimination and unethical practices within our company. This isn't about isolated incidents. It's about a culture that has been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long." Sophia reached into her folder and laid out several sheets of paper in front of her. "Here is a detailed report of complaints filed by our passengers and employees over the last 3 years. Many of these cases were dismissed without investigation. Many more were swept under the rug entirely." A murmur rippled through the room, but Sophia raised her voice slightly to cut through the noise. "These aren't just complaints. They are reflections of a culture that prioritizes exclusivity over inclusivity, profit over principle. And I am here to tell you that this ends now." A hand shot up from the far end of the table. It was Richard Kane, his expression a carefully crafted mask of indignation. "Sophia," he began, his voice measured but condescending, "while I understand your passion for these issues, I think it's important to remember the realities of running a business. We serve a specific clientele, high-value customers who expect a certain standard. Compromising that standard to cater to everyone is a risk we can't afford to take." Sophia's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "Are you saying that fairness and equality are incompatible with our business model?" "I'm saying," Richard replied smoothly, that this idealistic approach might look good on paper, but it doesn't translate to the bottom line. We've built our success on understanding who our customers are. Changing that now could alienate the very people who sustain this company. Several heads nodded in agreement, but Sophia refused to back down. With all due respect, Richard, she said, her voice cool, your bottom line argument doesn't hold up when weighed against the long-term damage these practices are doing to our reputation. Ignoring these issues might seem like the easier choice, but it's not the right one. Richard's mask slipped for a moment, revealing a flicker of irritation. And you think this crusade of yours won't damage our reputation? Publicly airing our dirty laundry could destroy us faster than anything else. Sophia turned to the other executives in the room, her gaze sweeping across them. What will destroy us, she said firmly, is doing nothing. If we want Skyline Airways to remain a leader in this industry, we need to rebuild trust with our customers, our employees, and the public. The room fell silent as Sophia's words hung in the air. I am proposing a full overhaul of our customer service protocols, she continued. This includes mandatory training on diversity and inclusivity, the creation of an independent oversight committee to handle complaints, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination at every level of the company. These changes won't be easy, but they are necessary. Her declaration was met with mixed reactions. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged wary glances. Richard, however, wasn't finished. Sophia, this is reckless, he said, his tone sharper now. You're risking everything we've built for the sake of optics. Our investors won't stand for it. Sophia met his gaze, unflinching. Our investors deserve to know the truth, and I believe they'll see the value in a company that leads with integrity. Later that evening, news of the meeting leaked to the press. Headlines splashed across major outlets, with some praising Sophia's bold stance, while others framed it as a divisive gamble. Richard seized the moment, granting interviews where he painted Sophia as inexperienced and overly idealistic. Skyline needs a leader who understands the complexities of this industry, he told one reporter. Sophia's decisions, while well-meaning, could have catastrophic consequences. Sophia read the headlines with a sinking feeling in her chest. The narrative was spinning out of control, and the pressure was mounting. That night, her phone buzzed with a call from Henry Walsh. You need to get ahead of this, he said without preamble. If you let Richard control the narrative, you'll lose public support before you even have a chance to explain your vision. Sophia exhaled deeply. What do you suggest? A press conference, Henry replied. Lay it all out for the public. What you found, what you're planning, and why it matters. If you're honest and transparent, people will listen. Sophia nodded, her resolve hardening. You're right. It's time to make my case. The bright lights of the conference room were blinding as Sophia stood at the podium, facing a sea of cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers. The Skyline Airways logo glimmered behind her, its polished surface reflecting the intense atmosphere. She adjusted the microphone slightly, the murmur of the crowd quieting as she prepared to speak. Sophia took a deep breath, scanning the room. Investors, employees, and representatives from every major media outlet in the country were present. This was her moment to confront not only the company's flaws, but also the growing public scrutiny of her leadership. Good afternoon, she began, her voice clear and unwavering. Today I stand before you not only as the CEO of Skyline Airways, but as someone who believes in accountability, transparency, and the power of change. She paused, allowing her words to resonate. Over the past few weeks, we've uncovered troubling practices within our organization. Practices that have compromised the integrity of our company and betrayed the trust of our employees and customers. For that, I want to start by saying I am deeply sorry. The room fell silent. Even the most skeptical faces in the crowd appeared taken aback by her candor. This is not who we are, Sophia continued, and it's certainly not who we want to be. That's why, effective immediately, Skyline Airways is launching a comprehensive reform plan to address these issues and ensure they never happen again. She outlined her vision with precision and clarity. First, we will establish an independent oversight committee to review and address all complaints related to customer service and workplace conduct. This committee will operate without interference, ensuring that every voice is heard. Second, we are implementing mandatory training for all employees on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This training will not be a one-time event, but an ongoing commitment to fostering a culture of respect and understanding. And third, Skyline Airways will allocate significant funding to support community programs aimed at promoting inclusivity in the aviation industry. We believe in leading by example, not only within our company, but throughout our entire sector. Her words were met with scattered applause, but the tension in the room remained thick. Before Sophia could continue, a voice rang out from the back of the room. And what about the financial impact of all this? The crowd parted slightly, revealing Richard Kane as he stepped forward. He was impeccably dressed, his expression calm but his tone sharp. Sophia, do you really expect us to believe that these changes won't cripple the company? Your plans might sound noble, but they're naive. Skyline can't afford to gamble its future on idealism. The room buzzed with whispers as Richard made his way toward the stage. He held up a document, waving it for emphasis. This, he said, his voice rising, is a financial analysis that shows the potential fallout from Sophia's decisions. Reduced revenue, increased costs, and a significant loss of high-value clients. If we go down this path, Skyline Airways won't survive the year. Reporters scrambled to capture his words and several hands shot up, eager to ask questions. Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on Richard. "May I see that document?" she asked coolly. Richard hesitated, but the weight of the crowd's gaze forced him to comply. He handed her the paper, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips. Sophia scanned the document quickly, her sharp mind identifying inconsistencies almost immediately. "This report," she said, holding it up for the crowd to see, "is not only inaccurate but intentionally misleading. These numbers are based on hypothetical scenarios that assume our customers and employees have no interest in integrity or progress. That assumption couldn't be further from the truth." She placed the document on the podium and looked directly at Richard. "What you failed to include, Richard, is the cost of doing nothing. Ignoring these issues would erode our reputation, alienate our customers, and ultimately cost us far more than any short-term adjustments ever could." The audience erupted in murmurs, but Sophia wasn't done. "And while we're on the subject of transparency," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "I think it's time we address some of your actions, Richard." She pulled out a folder from the podium and opened it. "This," she said, holding up an email, "is a communication between you and a select group of investors, detailing plans to prioritize certain clients while deliberately marginalizing others. And this," she added, holding up another document, "is proof that you've been diverting company resources to fund these preferential treatments, all while pocketing financial benefits for yourself." Gasps filled the room as cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously, their attention now fully on Richard. Richard's composure cracked. "This is absurd," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "You're twisting the facts to cover your own incompetence." Sophia didn't waver. "The facts speak for themselves, Richard. And if you have nothing to hide, you should have no problem cooperating with a full investigation." The room erupted into chaos as reporters shouted questions and executives exchanged hushed whispers. Richard's face turned crimson, and for a moment he looked as though he might storm out. But instead he leaned in close to Sophia and whispered, "You think this is over? I still have connections. Connections you'll never touch." Sophia met his gaze without blinking. "You're welcome to try, Richard, but the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it." By the end of the press conference, the board had no choice but to suspend Richard, pending a full investigation. The public backlash was immediate, with social media lighting up in support of Sophia's reforms and outrage at Richard's actions. That evening, as Sophia sat in her office, reflecting on the day's events, she felt both relief and exhaustion. The battle with Richard might have ended, but the war to rebuild Skyline Airways had just begun. Sophia sat at her desk in the dim light of her office, the weight of the day pressing heavily on her shoulders. The press conference had been a victory, but it was far from the end. Her assistant had just informed her of an emergency meeting being called by several major investors. The name at the center of it all, Richard Kane. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edges of the documents she'd been reviewing. The stakes were higher than ever. Richard was mobilizing his allies, attempting to force the board to reconsider her leadership. If he succeeded, it wouldn't just mean the loss of her position, it would mean the failure of everything she'd fought for. The phone buzzed on her desk, breaking her thoughts. It was Henry Walsh. "They're moving fast," Henry said, his voice steady but urgent. "Richard's pulling every string he can. He's painting you as a liability to the company, saying your reforms are destabilizing the business." Sophia exhaled slowly. "He won't stop, will he?" "No," Henry replied, "but neither should you. Listen, I've been talking to a few progressive investors. They believe in what you're doing, but they need reassurance. If you can show them how your plans will benefit the company in the long run, they'll back you." Sophia nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Thank you, Henry. I'll make my case." The next morning, Sophia began reaching out to her allies on the board. She scheduled one-on-one meetings with members she trusted, presenting them with a detailed plan for the company's future. She highlighted projections from her team's analysis, showing how improved customer satisfaction and a more inclusive culture could drive long-term profitability. "This isn't just about doing the right thing," she told them. "It's about ensuring the longevity of Skyline Airways. A company that values its employees and customers equally is a company that thrives." Her arguments resonated with some, but others remained hesitant, wary of Richard's influence. Meanwhile, Henry worked tirelessly behind the scenes, leveraging his connections to rally support. He reached out to consumer advocacy groups, journalists, and even former employees who had left the company due to its toxic culture. Together, they created a groundswell of public support for Sophia's reforms. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. The conference room was packed, with every board member present and several major investors joining via video call. Richard sat at one end of the table, his expression smug and confident. Sophia entered the room with quiet determination. She carried a slim portfolio, her focus entirely on the task ahead. Richard wasted no time, standing to address the room as soon as the meeting began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, his voice smooth and practiced, "we're here today because Skyline Airways is at a crossroads. Under Sophia's leadership, we've seen dramatic changes. Changes that, while well-intentioned, have caused significant disruption." He gestured toward a series of charts projected onto the screen behind him. "Here are the numbers. Declining profits, increased operational costs, and dissatisfied high-value clients. These are the consequences of prioritizing ideals over practicality." Richard turned to face Sophia directly. "Sophia may believe she's doing what's best, but the reality is clear. Her vision is jeopardizing this company's future." The room was silent as Richard sat down, his self-assured smile barely concealing his triumph. Sophia rose from her seat, her movements deliberate. She placed her portfolio on the table and addressed the room. "I appreciate your concerns, Richard," she began, her tone calm but resolute. "But let's take a closer look at those numbers." She clicked a button on the remote in her hand, bringing up a new set of charts on the screen. "These are the trends from the past 5 years, long before I implemented any reforms. Declining customer loyalty, an increase in unresolved complaints, and high employee turnover. These aren't new problems. They're the result of a culture that prioritizes exclusivity over excellence." Sophia moved to the center of the room, her gaze sweeping across the board members. "What I'm proposing isn't a gamble, it's a solution. Our data shows that by addressing these issues head-on, by creating a culture of inclusivity and respect, we can rebuild trust with our customers and employees. That trust translates into loyalty, and loyalty drives profit." The room was quiet, the board members leaning forward in their seats. But Sophia wasn't finished. "And now," she said, returning to her portfolio, "let's address the elephant in the room." She pulled out a series of documents and placed them on the table. "These are internal emails and financial records that my team uncovered. They show that Richard has been diverting company resources to fund preferential treatment for select clients. He's also accepted undisclosed financial benefits from these arrangements, in direct violation of company policy." Gasps echoed through the room as the evidence was passed around. Richard's confident demeanor shattered, his face reddening with anger. "This is absurd," he exclaimed, rising from his chair. "This is a smear campaign, nothing more." Sophia turned to him, her expression unyielding. The evidence speaks for itself, Richard. You've compromised the integrity of this company for personal gain. That ends today. The board members exchanged glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. After a tense deliberation, the chairman stood. "We'll take a vote of confidence on Sophia's leadership," he announced, "and we'll also vote on Richard's immediate suspension pending further investigation." The votes were cast, and when the results were tallied, Sophia had secured the majority support. Richard, on the other hand, was suspended indefinitely. As he left the room, Richard shot Sophia a look of pure venom. "You've made a powerful enemy today," he hissed. "This isn't over." Sophia met his gaze, her voice steady. "Do what you must, Richard. I'm not going anywhere." The auditorium at Skyline Airways headquarters was filled to capacity. Employees from every level of the company, executives, managers, flight attendants, and ground crew, had gathered for an unprecedented all-hands meeting. The energy in the room was a mixture of apprehension and anticipation, with everyone whispering about what Sophia Carter, their CEO, would say. At the front of the room, Sophia adjusted the microphone, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. Cameras were set up in the back, ready to stream the event live to employees watching remotely, as well as to media outlets covering the ongoing turmoil within the company. Sophia took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the most critical moment of her career. She knew that if she could reach the hearts of her employees, she could solidify the change she had been fighting for. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "Today I stand before you not just as your CEO, but as someone who has walked the path many of you have walked. Someone who has felt the weight of judgment, the sting of exclusion, and the frustration of fighting to be seen." The room fell silent, her words cutting through the tension. "I want to share a story," Sophia continued, her tone softening. "When I was a little girl, I would watch planes fly overhead and dream of what it would be like to soar above the clouds. But as I got older, I realized that not everyone is given an equal chance to reach those heights. I've faced doors that were closed to me, not because I wasn't capable, but because of the way I looked, the assumptions people made about who I was." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Even as I rose through the ranks of this industry, those assumptions never fully went away. And I know I'm not the only one. Many of you have experienced the same thing, whether it's being overlooked for opportunities, dismissed because of your background, or judged unfairly by a system that was never built to include you." The crowd was still, her story resonating deeply with many of the employees. "That's why I'm here today," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Not to point fingers or assign blame, but to say enough is enough. We have the power to change this company, to make Skyline Airways a place where everyone, employees and passengers alike, feels valued, respected, and included." Sophia outlined her vision for the future: mandatory diversity and inclusion training, a transparent oversight committee, and a company culture that prioritized fairness and accountability. She spoke passionately about the importance of building a legacy that transcended profits and focused on people. "This isn't just about fixing what's broken," she concluded. "It's about building something better, together." The room erupted into applause, and Sophia felt a glimmer of hope. The employees, many of whom had felt voiceless, were rallying behind her. As the applause subsided, the live broadcast cut to news networks, where commentators praised Sophia's candor and vision. Social media lit up with messages of support from customers, advocacy groups, and even former employees who shared their own experiences of discrimination within the company. The next day, Sophia wasted no time implementing her reform plans. She met with department heads to ensure the new policies were rolled out effectively and transparently. Her first directive was to prioritize a company-wide review of customer service practices, followed by the establishment of the Independent Oversight Committee. Amid the flurry of activity, Sophia received a letter from Jessica Whitman. The former flight attendant, who had been terminated weeks earlier, wrote to express her remorse. "I was wrong," Jessica admitted in the letter. "I let myself become a part of something I didn't fully understand, and I hurt people in the process. I'm sorry for the role I played, and I hope you succeed in creating the change this company desperately needs." Sophia read the letter twice before setting it aside. While she appreciated Jessica's apology, she knew this fight wasn't about personal redemption. It was about systemic change. She decided to use Jessica's story as a teaching moment, incorporating it into the company's new training materials to highlight how good people could become complicit in bad systems. The hum of activity within Skyline Airways headquarters was palpable as Sophia Carter walked through the halls. For the first time in months, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Conversations among employees were no longer tinged with fear or frustration. There was a sense of purpose, a shared belief that things were finally changing for the better. Sophia entered a large training room where the first session of the company's new diversity and inclusion program was underway. Employees from different departments filled the room, watching attentively as a facilitator spoke about the importance of empathy in customer service. The program was part of the comprehensive reform Sophia had promised. Designed to address biases and create a more inclusive workplace, it was mandatory for every employee, from the ground crew to senior executives. Sophia stayed in the back of the room, observing quietly. The facilitator asked the group to share their experiences with discrimination, both as employees and as individuals in society. A young flight attendant stood up, her voice trembling as she recounted an instance where she had felt dismissed by a manager simply because she was new. Another employee, a baggage handler, talked about being overlooked for promotions because English wasn't his first language. Sophia felt a pang of sadness as she listened, but she also felt pride. These conversations, though difficult, were necessary. People were being heard. Meanwhile, Richard Kane's downfall was making headlines. The former senior executive had been officially terminated and was facing legal action for his role in the corruption scandal. Investigations revealed years of financial misconduct and systemic discrimination that he had either enabled or directly orchestrated. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive of Skyline Airways' decision to sever ties with Richard. Customers and advocacy groups praised Sophia's leadership, calling it a much-needed step toward accountability in the corporate world. Jessica Whitman's story also took a surprising turn. After being dismissed from Skyline, she began attending workshops and speaking at events about her experiences. She openly admitted her role in perpetuating biases and shared how the company's reforms had opened her eyes. One day, Sophia received a letter from Jessica. "I don't expect forgiveness," Jessica wrote, "but I want you to know that your actions made me face my own flaws. Thank you for holding me accountable. It's given me a chance to change." Sophia read the letter twice. Her emotions conflicted. She appreciated Jessica's words but knew there was still much work to be done. One afternoon, as Sophia returned to her office after a meeting, she found a small envelope on her desk. It had no return address, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside was a single piece of paper with a brief, cryptic message. "You've won one battle, but more are coming. Stay vigilant." Sophia read the note twice, her expression unreadable. She folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. Then she turned to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. The challenges she had faced were only the beginning. She knew that. But as she stood there, watching the clouds drift across the horizon, her resolve remained unshaken. Sophia turned back to her desk, where a stack of documents awaited her attention. She picked up her pen, ready to dive back into her work. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," she said quietly to herself, a faint smile playing at her lips. The camera of life panned out, leaving her poised, determined, and unyielding. A leader prepared to confront whatever battles lay ahead. This story isn't just about Sophia Carter or Skyline Airways. It's about the courage to confront injustice, no matter how deeply rooted it is. It reminds us that real change starts with a single decision to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against us. What would you do if faced with a system that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of resilience, courage, and the power to create change.